Nah, no scare. Hey! Hello,
Is it
everyone.
working?
Yeah, I think it is.
Hello. All right. How you doing? We are the AP Comparative Government Group. My name is Sean Jacobson. I'm a teacher up here in New York City. Next to me, I guess we have that's
Me?
Bella. That's you.
Yeah, awesome. Well, so happy to be here, guys. My name is Isabella, but y'all can call me Bella. I'm originally from Brazil, and right now I'm talking to you guys from Denver.
Well, hi, my name is Nishka. I am from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm a senior in high school. Pass.
Hey guys, my name is David. I'm from Miami, Florida. I'm a senior. I self-studied comparative government last year, and right now I'm in Boston, just visiting. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here, guys.
Hey everyone, my name is Zach. I'm from Woodbury, Minnesota. I self-studied for comparative government last year, and yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Nice.
Awesome. Okay, so without further ado, I'm gonna share my screen so you guys can see the slides.
Yeah, I'm gonna pop
Let
them
me
away.
do that.
Can we get the poll question quickly?
Oh yeah, of course. All right.
Okay, we got a little
So we
icebreaker
so we
for you
really need
all.
to know because actually this has been a cause for disagreement or just discussion within our host discussions. So, answer the poll. It should be in your chat. Do you guys call this course AP Comp Gov or do you call it AP Gov?
I personally call it AP Kogo, and I think I'm the minority here.
I think you are.
I am a
Oh,
Comp
it's
O-
Gover. Yeah.
it's
Awesome.
close.
Oh, it is a close,
Oh.
yeah.
Oh,
Okay, I'm
CompGov
very
is pulling
surprised.
ahead, as it should be.
Wait, who has the something else? What else do we call it?
Comp poll, like comp
Oh,
politics.
interesting.
Interesting.
Really?
Interesting. Okay.
Honestly, Kopo does sound better than Kogo. Not gonna lie.
That is true. But neither sound as good as CompGov.
I agree.
Okay. As we're checking results, I think I'm just gonna jump right into the slides. So we go over
Yeah.
our community agreements and we get started. As you guys already know, this is a preview of what our crams are gonna be like. Our crams are gonna happen from May 3rd until May 7th, right before your exam. So here are a few of the community agreements. The first one that we really want to highlight is be supportive. Everyone here wants to get a five. Everyone wants to share their knowledge. So let's lift each other up. Be patient. We have 5 nights together. We're obviously not going to cover everything tonight. We will go separate the units into the nights that we're going to be presenting. So, but obviously, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask us. And we might actually say, hey, we're actually going to cover this at another day, if that's okay. And be kind. We're all real people. We will accept feedback, but remember that we're all humans. Here are a few notes of how to make the most of this finale. First is I don't know about y'all, but I really like taking notes when I'm studying. I feel like it really helps me retain information better. So if you want to take some notes as we're talking, if you have any questions for us and you want to write it down and maybe ask us later, don't forget to do that. This is the moment for you to figure out exactly which gaps you have in your knowledge as well. So maybe you want to do a to-do list of topics that you want to revisit later. I think this is a good time for that as well. Um, then you have my stuff, which is basically going to be your profile at the Fiveable website. And this is where you can access all the slides, such as the slide that I'm presenting to you guys right now, the review packet, and replays in case you want to revisit them at your own time later. We do have a group chat, and you guys are welcome to share anything in the group chat, advice, anything that has helped you throughout the course. And we also have a Q&A tab, which is mostly for asking questions to us, and you can vote as well. That's a really cool feature of Crowdcast, is that if you find a question that is relevant to you, you might want to vote so we can see that question easier. And yes, we will take breaks during our cram nights, and the replay will be available immediately after the event ends. Here are a few of the features so you get familiarized with them. Here's the symbol for the chat. It's where you can chat with the other attendees and with us. Then there's the Q&A session. As I just mentioned, it's going to be where you put all your questions for us and where you can vote for them. And the polls, like the poll that we just had for you guys right now, we have a few ones prepared for each night. Awesome. So just so you guys also know what the Cram model is all about, as part of the Cram model, you will have access to 40 prep books on different subjects, on SAT and ACT as well. You have 24/7 access to all of the unique practices that Fiveable has created, and you also have access to all the live events that we're going to be hosting for any exams. We understand that this might not be the only exam you're going to be taking this semester, so you also get access to that. Awesome. And don't forget to follow us on social media. We're going to be sending reminders and information about the hosts there. Okay. So we're just going to jump right in. As I said, this is a preview, so we're going to get into things a little more superficially than during the actual crams. The previews are only an hour, and the crams are about 3 hours long. So first of all, we're going to talk about democracies, democratization, and political regimes. It's very important for you guys to understand the difference between a political regime and a government system. When you're thinking about political regime, it really helps me to think of it as the ways of governance. So whereas the government system, then the government type is more about the different types of branches and how they interact with each other. The political regime can be seen as a spectrum from authoritarian to democratic. In an authoritarian regime, the power is concentrated in the hands of the government, and it's usually a very like centralized government in that way. And there is what we call the rule by law, which means that the authoritarian leaders are above the law. The law is usually created to control people, to create order and control, instead of being made by the people to help function, to help the system function better. And that's why it's called rule by law. Another feature that is kind of important about authoritarian regimes is that order and control are considered more important than personal rights and liberties. So usually the laws that are put in place are to control people and to maintain order instead of granting them rights and liberties. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the democratic regime, which demos means stands for people, and kratos means power. So its power is in the hands of the people, of the majority. And it's called rule of law because the law is what supersedes anything in that country. So no one is above the law. No politician, no leader is above the law. And the law is also meant to be fair. The law is put in place in a way that is equitable, in a way that affects everyone the same. So that's what we consider as fair. And in democratic regimes, it's very common to have a protection of your rights and liberties. There's a difference between rights and liberties. Rights usually relate to like equality, and liberties are your freedoms. But we'll get into that during the second preview night. So what? The type of government can determine a lot. It determines the role of citizens in the political process, so how involved they are. In authoritarian government, citizens don't get to participate as much. But in democratic governments, it's all about the people. So I love the Mean Girls meme saying, "Get in, loser, we're gonna go voting," because this is what democracy is about. It's about mobilizing people, and democracy is contagious. It's trying to bring in people to advocate for a bill and advocate for their rights. So this is a very important pillar of democratic regimes. And then the type of government also reflects and shapes societal values. Certain types of society are more collectivists. Others are more individualistic. So the type of government really kind of shapes that as well, and it influences decision-making process. So in democracies, citizens can go there and kind of give their input to the politicians in the decision-making process. That's not really the case in authoritarian regimes. It impacts the structure of the economy. We'll also get into that later on. But for example, in China, there's command economy, and it doesn't really allow for leeway or any creativity when it comes to creating new markets. And that's something that is determined by the type of government. And it also affects the liberty of media and civil society. Civil society, as we'll mention later today, is also a very important pillar of democratic regimes. And the stronger the civil society, the more democratic typically a regime is. Okay, so as I said, this is kind of a spectrum, but political regimes are very intertwined with the government system. So here are the different countries that are going to be included in your exam and their type of government systems. So the first one on the far left, we have China, which is an autocracy and oligarchy. And autocracies are usually meant for someone to be one person to have the most power. In that case, we the Secretary General in China, for example. In Russia, we consider it an illiberal democracy. That's because there is a democracy. They have elections. Just a few weeks ago, they had elections in Russia. But whether they are transparent or not, that's what makes it an illiberal democracy. In Iran, we have the theocracy. And in that way, the Sharia law is above everything else, and all the politicians and everyone has to abide by that. And it's all vested in a whole religious context as well. In representative democracy is the case for Nigeria and Mexico. They also host elections. They have representatives who are supposed to advocate for their constituents, but are they fair elections? And that's something they'll also get into. And we also have the UK, which is a constitutional monarchy. It's a monarchy because they still have the monarchs present, but they offer more of a symbolic presence in their system. But then they also have the House of Commons, for example, and a House of Lords, one of which the people are appointed and one of which people are elected, which that makes it a democracy, but a different type of democracy. Okay, so to wrap us up, you're going to hear the term democratic erosion. And democratic erosion is the slide to authoritarianism, which can happen in a few countries. And here are a few ways in which that can happen. So powerful individuals can justify power by calling it tradition. So a religious leader can say, hey, I have divine rights to be here leading, and this is tradition, and that's the way it is, and no one can contest that. That's the way that certain countries kind of go down into authoritarianism. Another thing is when they limit who can participate in politics. If not everyone, if minority groups are kind of excluded from the process, that's also not very democratic. Those in power set laws and rules, but don't necessarily follow them. So it's the rule of law that I was talking about. They're above it. They're the ones who can do whatever they want, but everyone else has to follow the laws they are creating. And the construction of artificial enemies to distract and divide. This is a populist tactic in which politicians create the other, and they're always fighting someone. They're always fighting an enemy instead of focusing on their own population. On the other hand, we have the ladder to democratization. A way in which countries can democratize is by establishing rule of law and free and fair elections, protecting human rights and civil liberties, by increasing the participation of citizens in civic life. So, as I said, civil society is very important when it comes to that. And open access to information. Information is power. Information to be able to contest what your politicians are saying, information for you to be able to think critically. Usually, authoritarian governments are trying to undermine that. So, here are just a few things to keep in mind. Now, Zach, what are you going to be presenting to us today?
Hey everyone. Oh, I'm on the main stage. We move to stage left really quick. There we
There
go.
you go.
I'm doing governmental systems for us today. I got a little bit less than Bella did, so I'm a little worried because she barely got to the 15-minute mark, and I have like half her stuff. But
Okay.
we'll see what we can do. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about governmental systems. I'm going to be comparing presidential versus semi-presidential and then parliamentary. And you can see the presidential system here. On this slide, I'm not going to go super in depth with all of them because we're going to talk about each one individually a little bit more. So yeah, presidential systems. It's what it sounds like, right? Pretty self-explanatory. It's defined around a president. These are all questions of how are we going to split up the executive branch and see how that executive branch gets its power. So in a presidential system, the president has the power within the executive branch, and notably, it's separate from the legislature, right? The legislature is not choosing the president, the people choose the president. And this allows for greater separation of the executive and legislature powers, and that creates some natural checks and balances. Compare this to a semi-presidential system where power is divided between. Actually, could you add the parliamentary one first so I can
Yeah,
I'm gonna
go
say
ahead.
parliamentary. I'm gonna do parliamentary first, really quick. Parliamentary is kind of the opposite of a presidential system, right? The legislature can elect and remove the prime minister, the leader of the executive branch, from office, and this means that the legislature is the one that is picking the president. The people are not picking the president. The people are picking the president to then pick the the people are picking the legislature to then pick the prime minister, to pick their executive. And so this leads to a fused legislative and executive branch. And that leads to less natural checks and balances because the president, the executive, there's no separate executive from the legislative. The legislative chooses the executive. And that's not to say that it's inherently undemocratic, right? The United Kingdom is considered to be our most democratic country of our core six, and the United Kingdom is a parliamentary system. The people still ultimately hold the power because the people are picking the legislature, and the legislature is picking the executive. They're picking the prime minister. I'm saying picking a lot. And then for the semi-presidential, it's the combination between presidential and parliamentary. The power is divided between the head of state and the head of government. The head of state being the president, and the head of government being the prime minister. Oh, we were going to do a poll. Yeah. Really quickly, everyone go answer your favorite country to study. I'm going to keep talking while you guys vote. China's winning? Really? Wow. That's
Oh,
not
wow.
bad. But I'll keep going. So the power is divided between the president, which would be elected, like we previously said, by the people, separate from the legislature, and the parliamentary system, where the prime minister is selected by the legislature. It's a combination of those two ideas, and now you have two people leading the executive. Typically, the president will be the one that helps set policy, and the prime minister is the one that executes it and actually enforces it and sets their ministers to go enforce the law. And you can move on to the next slide.
Awesome.
And so now we're going to get more in depth with what these actually look like in practice. So, like I said, the president is directly elected by the people and can call on a national mandate to create and enact legislation. The president is the leader of the country. There's no really main doubt about it. The president holds the executive power. And this creates strong checks and balances because the people elect the president and they elect the legislature. It's separate branches of government. And the legislature and the president may be more likely to clash, right? Which kind of brings us to the gridlock. Because they're separate entities and because they don't necessarily align with each other, in every single policy, there may be more gridlock. An example of this is in Mexico or in Nigeria, where the Congress may disagree on a policy with the president, and that creates conflict and compromise, which is required. And there's also fixed terms. If the president loses party support, removal is difficult. In Nigeria, for instance, if the the president were to be exposed with a corruption allegation, they're already in office for 4 years. There's a long impeachment process that they must go through compared to a parliamentary system, which is much more simple to remove a leader because the terms aren't fixed. An additional info, the cabinet is chosen separate from the legislature. This goes back to the whole separate powers thing, too, between the executive and legislative. The president is the one that is picking the cabinet. The president gets control of the cabinet. They get control of the executive branch. That's the main takeaway with the presidential system. Semi-presidential we'll go over kind of quicker because there's only one semi-presidential, and it's kind of a weird example that doesn't always fit with how a semi-presidential would work. Like we said before, it's a mix between the parliamentary and the presidential system. The president is directly elected, and the prime minister is elected by the legislature, or indirect, so it's indirectly elected by the people. And they share powers and responsibilities, which creates a public mandate. And then the disadvantage is that there's potential for conflict, just like how there's potential between the executive and legislature in the presidential system. It's the same thing here. It's the same thing with the semi-presidential system. The legislature, led by the prime minister, may disagree with on a policy compared to the president. In Russia, for instance, which is our main example, our only example for a semi-presidential system, there tends not to be large amounts of conflict because the president holds so much more power over the prime minister. President Putin holds a lot more power and uses his powers a lot more aggressively to gain control within the country, which is why Russia isn't the only example of semi-presidential. So we have examples, and you don't need to know this for the test, to be clear, but we have other examples such as France and Taiwan, where there's more split powers between the president and the prime minister, right? However, in Russia, that does not tend to be the case because Putin has taken so much power for himself. The prime minister tends to more act as his enforcer of his will. And then lastly, for the parliamentary, we have the United Kingdom. The prime minister is the head of the legislature, and as such, he or she has a lot of control over the legislature because they have party majority. They were elected there. It was their party that managed to win the election, and so they have much further control and are able to quickly pass their legislation. And they can also be easily removed. Contrast this with the presidential system. The president has to go through an impeachment process. They have a fixed term. There's a much more complicated system. The prime minister, if they lose support of parliament, then the parliament can choose to remove the prime minister. This happened in the United Kingdom, not technically, but it looked like the Parliament was likely to remove both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss at certain points because of different scandals and inefficiencies that they had going on. Because of that, they chose to resign. That's not as common within presidential systems because the process of removal is much more difficult. And I see Sean, our teacher here, brought up lettuce. If this helps connect it to you, that was the prime minister that lasted shorter than Liz Truss was the prime minister that lasted shorter than a head of lettuce, which has become her main legacy within, I think, her 40 days, while she was prime minister. And like we said, the public does not directly elect the prime minister, which can lead to them feel like they're not being represented by their government. I'm assuming a lot of you are American here. If you are far more likely to feel connected to the president than you are to the Speaker of the House, because you didn't directly choose the Speaker of the House. You didn't go out and vote for the Speaker of the House. We have a great question here, actually, so I want to dive into this really quick. Iran's system is not technically considered presidential because the supreme leader is not technically a parliamentary figure. The supreme leader has much more power than the president, you are correct, and it is quite similar to Russia, but it's ultimately not chosen by the legislature. The semi-presidential system implies a power conflict between a prime minister, or whatever name they take. Sometimes that's like chancellor, but for all the countries in our core group, it should be prime minister, and the president. So yes, Iran does have a similar conflict, and I would encourage you, if you ever get a question on that, to explore that in your FRQ. But it is different because it's not the conflict between an executive and a legislature. Does that make sense? I don't know how quickly they can hear me and respond. So I'll leave it be and I'll finish this up really quick. The public does not. Okay, cool. We got it. Yeah, they feel slightly. It's possible for them to feel unrepresented. You're more likely to feel closer to your president because you voted for them than you are to your Speaker of the House, right? That's a good example if you live in America. And it's a similar concept for the parliamentary system. However, again, to reiterate, it does not mean that it is not a democratic system. It is not a less democratic system. If the legislature is being chosen by the people, then the people are indirectly but still choosing their leaders. It is still a democratic system. And then lastly, the cabinet is chosen from the legislature. This gets back to that fused power idea. The executive ultimately is just a sub branch of the legislature. The legislature chooses the executive. So this is the three main ways that we see in comparative government, how we divide up different ways to share the executive power. There are other ways, such as Iran and China, in which it becomes more complicated and they doesn't really cleanly fit into any of these three, as we previously discussed. And those will not be asked about as one of these three systems. They're unique to those countries. I think that's it. David, are you doing the third one for us?
Yes, I am. Let me move
All right.
myself where I have to be. All right. Hey guys, so before I get started on the conversation on civil society, I guess the question I wanted to bring up, if you guys could talk about it in the chat, why did you choose that country specifically to study? Like I personally prefer Mexico, because I guess probably because of its similarities to the US in terms of like government systems, but also because I'm Hispanic and like I have a connection to like Hispanic countries like that. So I guess we just want to know more about your inclination towards a certain country or why you find it so interesting. I think that's super, super cool. I actually didn't expect it to be so spread out, but here we are. You guys could just drop your reasonings in the chat, and I'm gonna start the conversation on civil society.
Awesome.
So the civil society or civil societies are going to be behind democratization. I would say one of the most important concepts that you will learn and indulge in while you're studying AP Comparative Government, because it encompasses so much. Civil societies are basically all autonomous organizations outside of the state that help people define and advance their own interests. They might still have political motives, but it's important to understand that civil society groups have no relation to the state, have no control of the state, and usually don't receive public funds. So civil societies could include religious organizations, whether they're Islamic or Jewish or Christian. There's a lot of religious organizations that try to push forth certain interests. Neighborhood organizations, even as small as a homeowners association, have interests that they want to advance in a local government, in a state government. Those are also included within civil society groups. News outlets as a whole, I would say like CNN, Fox News, even like the NPR, which has been in the news lately, the National Public Radio. These are all civil society groups that have an interest or a bias that they want to bring forth to a specific people, to a specific demographic. Then you have business and professional organizations. These organizations they could be anything. They could be from doctors to lawyers to blue collar workers, all white collar workers. These have interests that they want to again further in a society. And then on NGOs or non-governmental organizations, which pursue policy objectives and foster public participation. So this is probably the broadest of the categories here, but I guess the NGOs that one would think of are like the UN civil society groups, the UN's like the WHO, And the UN as a whole is also an NGO. So I think that's something to definitely consider. So an important note here is that generally democratic regimes allow for a more robust and integrated civil society than authoritarian regimes because civil society strengthen democratic governance through participation. So I had mentioned democratization before, as Bella covered it before, but the civil society and democracy are very intertwined concepts. So again, one of the most important things you will learn in Comp Gov. Next slide, please.
Okay.
And also, I saw in the chat. I thought these are super cool reasons. Like Ella, you mentioned that Russia was a bit confusing, especially because of that unique semi-presidential system. But I totally get it. Like that's one of the reasons that like fun to learn. It's something new. But super cool. So let's talk about specific countries and their civil societies. So the United Kingdom is going to have the most well-established civil society of our 6 countries. They, like the United States, they have a complete freedom of the press, freedom of speech that allows for these societies to form and advance their interests to governments. So examples here would be the Trade Union Congress, which is an organization of, I'm sorry, I might be not remembering right now. But I know the Confederation of British Industry is a group of finance workers that have a lot of influence on policy and how it governs the UK as a whole. I'll try to get back to you on what the Trade Union Congress is, though. So Nigeria, even though it is a democratic regime right now, it still continues to have an underdeveloped civil society. Since 1999, the civil society has become a lot more emerged. Usually, when a democratic regime takes precedence, like becomes the ruling government, like regime of a country, people are able to focus on what matters to them, like personally. So that's why civil societies become a lot more robust in non-authoritarian regimes. There are many informal ethnic and religious associations. If you can recall that Nigeria is almost perfectly evenly split north to south, Christian and Muslim, with the south being predominantly a Christian region of the country, and the north being Muslim. So there's a lot of civil society groups that are trying to push forth these religious interests in government, and I think that's also a really cool thing that makes Nigeria really unique. And so in 2017, there was a bill passed in the Nigerian Congress to regulate non-governmental associations, which is a really big threat to the civil society. And I guess like a drawback to Nigeria's push forth to democratization. So these are all things to understand. Democratization, even though it is a spectrum, the process of democratization is not fully linear. It does not go straight in one way. It's usually it bounces back and forth a lot. And as we see with this bill in 2017 in Nigeria, that is definitely happening. So now we have Mexico and their well-established civil society. So even though the pre-government ended in the year 2000, a lot of these interests were able to be pushed forth by the Mexican people beforehand. So I'll read the bullet point. Despite one-party domination for over 70 years, the civil society has always existed. Since 2000, the civil society has rapidly expanded. What comes to mind and what has been a big issue in Mexico within the past 24 years has been the issues of women's rights in Mexico, especially. And Mexico has actually been the trailblazer of women's rights protests and civil society groups throughout Latin America. Mexico, even in like the past years, have had really big issues with feminicide or like female homicides, rape, abuse. That unfortunately has really plagued Mexican culture. So these groups have been really important in bringing progress against these types of crimes in Mexico, and they can have an effect outside of governments, so it's such as seen outside of like an actual country government, as seen as like with the rest of Latin America. So if you could please move on to the next slide. So now we're gonna go over our more authoritarian regimes, and now we can start to see our stark differences. So China has an extremely underdeveloped civil society. The government controls the media and internet, which limits NGOs. And since opening the economy to foreign investors, some private organizations have emerged. So I guess those private civil societies, they are there to create a facade of democracy and that a country is is moving in that direction. But in reality, it is known that the CCP has full control over these organizations. So in reality, civil society groups that are independent of the state don't really exist in China. Even though it may seem that they do, um, interests are usually never to change things in government or to change things in locally, because that is just not simply an aspect of life. Remember, the rule by law is what predominates in the Chinese government. Now, in Russia, it's a very similar story with an underdeveloped civil society, though it has a little bit more holes in the netting, as you may have seen recently, um, with the death of Alexei Navalny, which was he was a Russian opposition leader, um, who died under mysterious reasons recently. But I'll get into that in a moment. So the Russian country has a really underdeveloped civil society, which has been highly limited by the government of Putin, ran by Putin since the fall of since I believe it's the year 2000. The 2006 law that required all NGOs to be approved by the government, restricting funding from foreign services, and made them subject to regular inspections. So similar to China, the civil society groups within Russia have almost no control over what happens in the government, over what happens locally, because they are fully controlled. They don't have influence, and as seen with the protests with Alexei Navalny, because of Alexei Navalny's death, um, a lot of people were arrested because subsequent to the protest, because they spoke up for what they wanted changed. And I think that's very indicative of the point on the democratization spectrum that Russia is in. And now we have Iran. So Iran has an extremely underdeveloped civil society, of course, because of its authoritarian regime, as seen with Russia and China, but also because of its theocratic regime, and how Sharia law governs the country. So the government has extremely limited public gatherings. They have limited free speech, and they have limited public media. The young people who are attracted to Western ideas help advance a civil society, but these, as seen with Russia and China, there's simply most of these efforts are fruitless. Um, the civil society has no power over what happens in government, in comparison to like Mexico or the UK, where the civil society has a strong effects on what bills are passed, on what happens in the country, on what people know. So in Iran, Russia, and China, they they have no such power, and I think that's very important to understand. Um, if you guys have any questions, I think I'm done here. But if you guys have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat. You guys, we have the normal chat, but also any burning questions that you may have that may be important relating to the content, please feel free to put in the Q&A chat. All right, Nishka, I think you're next.
Ooh,
You're
I think
still
you're
muted.
muted.
Thank you for letting me know. So I just opened another poll in the chat, which is what country of the AP COGO 6 would you want to move to? For me personally, I would say the UK, because it's probably the most similar to America, easiest to adjust, and I speak English and I don't speak any of these other languages, but drop in the chat why you guys would decide what country to move into. So while you guys are debating about that, let's talk about electoral systems and the different types of them. So there's three main ones. Majoritarian, proportional representation, and then mixed systems. So a majoritarian is a winner takes all. It's what you think of when you think of a democracy in election. The candidate with the most votes wins. This helps to give legitimacy to whatever or whoever the leader is, because if the majority of the population voted for them, then they must be the right candidate to lead. It's what we think of when we think of democracy. And it has the added advantage that it's pretty simple and you don't need complicated hoops or things to go through because you just vote for one president and the person with the greatest amount of votes wins. When we move on to proportional representation, this is where things get a little bit more tricky. So there are subgroups that are reflected proportionately to however many people. So for example, if a certain party gets 34% of the votes in Congress, they would have about 34% of the seats, or however that breakdown works. This is a little less simple because this means there are multiple parties than just, the one or two, but it gives representation to minority groups. So say there was a new political party that came up in a country and they only received 10% of the votes because they're new. That still could guarantee them a few seats in the Congress or whatever their electoral system is and allow them some power. And then finally is the mixed system. It combines both the first past the post voting system used by a majority of countries and proportional representation, which is often including other parties. So if you can move on to the next slide, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a note about proportional representation, if you allow me.
Yeah,
I think Americans are very used to saying two parties and pushing for kind of opposing agendas. I think the interesting thing about studying other countries is that you can see that there are other agendas that they're trying to push for, and there's everything in between, and there are other minority groups that might not agree with like the predominant agendas, right? So I think that's why proportional representation has a strong tie to democratization as well. So that's something to keep in mind.
That's actually a really good point that Bella brought up. When I was studying COGO, our teacher actually showed us a map of the UK, and you can see all of the different parties. And just compared to the two parties we think of when we think of the American system, there's like over 15 to 16 like major parties, and then 10 or so more minority parties. So proportional representation really allows for a diverse body. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. So let's move on to a case study of electoral systems and trying to determine what countries. Also, I see you, Sean, in the chat. I still say it's COGO, but all right. So China has the National People's Congress, which is a indirect elections at various levels. So the way I was taught is think of this like a triangle pyramid where there is power. There's more people at the bottom, and it slowly goes up to the prime minister at the top, who's Xi Jinping currently. And we can often see with China's electoral system, the processes for voting aren't as clear as my previous co-host mentioned, because their electoral systems and the way they vote are not as transparent. So when we look at Iran, we have the Majalis, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that, and who is the top of the leader in their Congress, and they have multiple single-member districts, which are vetted by a guardian council. This is important to remember that Iran is a theocracy, so they have what they do is by religious or a lot of religious reasons. So that's why they are vetted by a guardian council, which is something to just take note of. But they also are a bit more democratic in the way that they allow seats for Jews, Christians, and Zoronites, which are three different types of religions that are also pretty prevalent in Iran. So moving on to Mexico, they have single-member districts for about 300 members and proportional representation for about 200 of their members in Congress. So that means it's kind of split. So 300 of their Congress is made of 500 people. 300 of those are elected in the proportional representation system that Bella previously mentioned. And 200 of them were proportional and 300 were single member districts, which are majority or first past the post systems. Another interesting thing to actually note about Mexico is that they have gender quotas, which is why I really liked learning about their congressional and electoral system. So for them, it is required that 50% of their electoral districts and 50% are women and 50% are men to try to have more equal representation. Their idea is if 50% of the population are women and 50% are men, that should be the way it's, represented in their democracy. So moving on to Nigeria, they have single-member districts that are representative of the entire country, and they have a Senate, which is every 3 years elected. Russia, on the other hand, is, remember, a semi-presidential system, so half of the representatives are elected in a single-member district style, and half are elected in a proportional representation style with a threshold saying that, for example, there's almost like a cap on how many people from certain parties are able to allow the votes. And a note that why Russia does this is, remember, they are authoritarian regimes. So if they don't have these thresholds within their proportional representation system, well, a party that Putin or whoever the leader is, could become in power. Yeah, so a question in the chat is, China has two national parties, the National People's Congress and the National Party in Congress. I'm not sure if that's being answered in the chat, but sorry, it is.
I'll answer it now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, actually, I'm in the wing, but I'd love to answer it just
No, go
here.
ahead.
So the National Party Congress and the National People's Congress are both like organizations that carry forth government in China, but they're extremely intertwined. So the National People's Congress does have some representation from other parties, though it's extremely, extremely small. The National Party Congress is made up of all the CCP members of the National People's Congress, though the National Party Congress is what actually makes the decisions in China and brings them forth. So the National Party Congress is the CCP and what makes the entire decision making. So that's an important distinction, but honestly, for the in the case of the exam, you could think of them as almost identical. They consist of almost the same people.
Yeah, that nuance is pretty small, but David did a really good job explaining that. But in terms of, if you're passionate about learning this, that's something to know. But for the exam, the National People's Congress is the one that has the power. And when the exam asks you, they're typically referring to just this one. And then finally, last but not least, are UK. They have single-member districts with first past the post voting. So in each district, I guess whatever has the majority or the most votes typically tends to win. So Bella, can we move on to the next slide, please? All right. So why do voting systems matter, and why do we matter that we have different ones? Well, the biggest reason is influence on voting behavior. You can see that with certain types of voting systems, such as proportional, we can see more minority groups or more underrepresented groups. This leads into ideas of political socialization, which is systems influencing political values, ideas, attitudes, and perceptions. So when people feel represented, or in a democracy or a regime where they are represented, there are more political socializations as there's more ideas out there. This also comes from the idea of media influence. So systems influence the role of media and electoral processes, because media, as we know, and transparency, as we know, is a big key factor to democracy. So the media can help sway an election in either way. And then finally, economic conditions. So systems influence economic conditions of a country or a specific subgroup. It's pretty easy to see that when a country has certain economic highs or lows, a certain party can also follow that. For example, if a country is going through a hard time, we can see that certain political groups may come to power or rise, as the Labour Party in the UK is one, for example, that we'll go into more detail during the other night. If you want to go to the next slide, please.
Awesome.
All right, so crafting election rules. So having fair and free elections is a key testament to democracy. We need to ensure fairness and legitimacy, which is another big AP COGO term in our election rules. And we do this by making sure that there are representations and we have political strategy that represents everyone. Some challenges that can arise even in the most fair and free democracies, such as the UK or America, are gerrymandering, which by definition is the manipulation of the boundaries of electoral constituency, so to favor one party or class. To break that down into a little bit of a simpler term is, for example, if you take a state like the United States, which is I guess a good one for reference, and you draw certain lines and you have certain districts. Maybe a district has more people of one type of party, or for example, one type of race or one type of gender, and politicians and sometimes parties carefully craft these lines so that they could either win more or have the other party be diminished more by breaking up these lines.
Can I add something really quick?
Of course.
So with gerrymandering, I want to add some nuance that it connects back to the majoritarian first past the post system, because those are where the districts are being drawn. That's the system where there actually are districts to beat gerrymandered, right? In a proportional representation system, it's a very large area, or sometimes the entire country, that's voting. So with the majoritarian and first past the post system, gerrymandering can be a big problem, but it can be alleviated by switching over to proportional representation, which is kind of why it tends to be a more democratic system too, as Bella pointed out. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
No, that's great to mention that when we see all of these single member districts, this is where gerrymandering comes into play, because people want to shift where those certain districts are to, help or support them, which is a great example of voter suppression, which is more typical in a majoritarian or first past the post system rather than a proportional representation system, as Zach mentioned. And then finally, electoral fraud, which is where a country may not be completely transparent about the results of the election or how they're run. A great example of this is Russia, which claims to have elections, but we can't really see the results of the elections, how they're being run. And there's many, examples or cases of voter fraud or electoral fraud that the country just refuses to acknowledge, which is a great difference on what makes it authoritarian versus the UK or even Mexico, that are a bit more transparent about how and why their elections are run the way they are.
Cool. Before I move on to the next slide, I think we have a survey. You might see a green button. I don't know if that's visible. Hopefully it is. So you guys can click on that and take a survey. Okay.
All right. And then finally, we have variations across democracies. So single member districts are electoral districts represented by a single office holder, which is, again, more in a majoritarian take, but it means that a district is represented by a single Congress member or a single, House member, or whatever it is for whatever electoral system, versus a multi-member district where a specific district within a state or a county are represented by multiple office holders. So the difference between that is you're either voting for one representative that represents you in your entire district, or multiple. And we can see also first past the post is voters cast a vote for a single candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. So when we think of typical single member districts with first past the post, that's you are voting for your candidate, and whichever candidate, the single candidate that has the most votes, becomes your elected representative. Versus ranked choice voting, where you have multiple candidates and you rank them by, I want first this person, second this person, third this person, so on for however many. And voters rank candidates by preferences for their ballots, which can allow for multiple people to represent a specific district. This also is most common for runoff votings, because typically when we see this happen, ranked choice voting is also, there's a lot of ties or could have runoffs. If you remember back to a few previous slides when we talked about majoritarian, they are the simplest because they follow first past the post, because 51% or more you win, compared to ranked choice voting, where there can often be ties or uncertainties on who wins, which leads to a lot of runoff voting. All right, and then our last case study based on election rules. So Iranian president, they typically win the absolute majority in the first round. So that means they need to win more than 51%, or else they would go, or more than the majority, or then they would need to go to a runoff election. So the Guardian Council, which, remember, they are the people who vet the president and the people allowed to run, typically exclude reformists and people who are more radical in the sense. And then half of the Guardian Council is selected by the Supreme Leader, who is the head honcho. He is the head of state. And the other half are elected by judiciary nominees with the Majalis's approval. So the Supreme Leader does get 50% of say in who the Guardian Council is, but the other 50% is through representation of what the judiciary and the other Congress want, with approval, of course. Moving on to Mexico. So the Mexican president is elected by a plurality form, which means, a plurality form, and they have the INE Election Commission, which they're trying to make more fair and more free. So moving on to Nigeria, the Nigerian president must get at least 25% of the votes in 2/3 of the state, or 2/3 of the states. So if there are 9 states, they need to get at least 25% of the votes in 6 of the states. I'm not sure the exact number. I'm just using that to kind of give you guys a representation. And then they have the INEC as their election commissions. And just to clarify, election commissions are what democracies or transitional governments who are trying to be more democratic have to, I guess, be more transparent about their election. So if there's election fraud or issues or anything that's raised up, it's the election commission that is in charge of handling these disputes and communicating with the civilians on how their elections are being run. So, for example, Russia, the president must win an absolute majority in the first vote. Or if they don't win, they typically go to a second runoff, like Iran, but that doesn't typically happen in Russia, as we've known, because they are an authoritarian state. So Russia has the Federal Council, which are recommended by regional governments. So people can recommend them, but ultimately they are selected by Putin. So we can see that even though they do have a commission for their election, it is selected by Putin. So we can only, I guess how fair and free that these electoral commissions are. And then finally, the UK has the House of Lords, which is their upper house of Congress, and they are all appointed members. Versus the House of Commons, which are elected by representation. All right, it is now time for a practice quiz. If you guys are ready for that, you can scan the QR code and it'll take you to a practice quiz that we've created. So, you guys want to take a second and join that?
Just want to chime in. You also have the link to the quiz right below the slides, right below us. So you can do if you want to do the quiz from your phone, you can scan the QR code. Should work. If not, just click the button. And yeah, we'll get started as soon as possible. I'm just gonna wait for everybody to join in.
I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. David, do you maybe want to go over the results of the quiz? And share your screen.
But the thing is, I'm not able to share my screen. Maybe if Bella, you can join the quiz from your computer and just display it, and then we can go over if the question needs clarification. All right, I'm going to start the quiz now. All right.
Let me try to share my screen again.
How do political scientists most commonly define state?
Wait, I don't think there's music. I think the music is important. Give me a second.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna reveal it in 3, 2, 1. All right, you guys all did great on that one. All right, so a state is a defined territory with sovereignty that has institutions making and enforcing policies. Let's move on to the next one. All right, what policy would a government guided by authoritarian nationalism be most likely to implement? All right, I'm gonna reveal it in 3, 2, 1. Cool, you guys also got that one right. So the correct answer was D. This says authoritarian nationalism would government would likely implement censorship of the media to promote national unity. All right, Next question. Which method of political participation has been most effective in influencing environmental policy decisions within authoritarian regimes? And even though the quiz has 11 questions, unfortunately, this is going to be our last one for tonight. But for our cram days, we will have a lot more of these, and I know these are extremely fun, and they will be a little bit more difficult. So definitely have
So
that. Have that in
come
mind.
back for the cram nights. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna reveal it in 3, 2, 1. All right. So, which method of political participation has been the most effective? So yes, grassroots petitioning would be effective, but the grassroots petitioning really doesn't exist in authoritarian regimes because the people don't have power. So really the correct answer would be B, because the state-sanctioned demonstration would show that people support the state. And the answer couldn't be D because it's an authoritarian regime. So even though it's over, please feel free to come back. We have our next preview on the 29th. So thank you guys.
Thank you
We look
guys for
forward to seeing you
coming.
soon.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. We hope to see you guys.
Yes, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
He wants to be the button to hit